Once upon a time, in a certain unhappy kingdom, there was a wicked and foolish king, and it seemed to his subjects that their king was truly evil and lived to make their lives more miserable. No one knew why this should be. As is true of most kings, this one was very wealthy, and he lived in a magnificent castle. But most of his people were very poor. And yet, this awful king wanted to make his subjects' lives even more miserable than they already were. So, he hatched a plan. He would find out as much as he could about each of his subjects one by one, and then he would find ways to make their lives harder still. To implement his plan, at the end of each day, when night fell, the king took off his royal garments and disguised himself as just another peasant in the kingdom. Then he would wander about, meeting his subjects in his disguise, and thinking of new ways to make their lives just a little more wretched. One night, the king came upon a small and decrepit cottage. It was in such a state of disrepair that at first the king thought surely no one lived there. Then he heard what sounded like singing coming from inside, so he walked to the door, knocked, and called out, "Does anyone live here?" Almost at once the door opened. Standing across from the king was an older man whose garments were in tatters, but he displayed a welcoming smile on his face. He seemed genuinely happy to have a visitor. He invited the disguised king inside and offered him what little food and drink he had. As the two men talked, the king learned that this man was a cobbler. He made and repaired shoes. But as they talked, the king became increasingly annoyed with this poor cobbler. The man, living in extreme poverty as he did, had the infuriating habit of giving thanks to God for every little thing he did have, and he only had little things. "I only have the one cup and saucer," the cobbler said to the king, "but that's all I needed when you came to visit, just the one." And he set before the king a slice of bread and a cup of water. "Blessed be God, day by day," he said. And if he said it once, he must have said it 100 times while the king was there. It was more than the king could take. As far as he could see, this man had nothing, but insisted on thanking God for it. Well, if anyone was to be thanked for what little this man had, surely it was his king. Without even thanking the cobbler for the food and drink he'd been given, the disguised king told the man that he must go. He stood and walked to the door. "If you're out this way again," the cobbler said, "and you're feeling hungry, do stop in." The king said nothing in reply, merely sneered beneath his royal mustache and left the cottage. On his way back to the castle, the king began to think of ways he could give this cobbler even fewer things about which he could say, "Blessed be God, day by day." Next morning, the king climbed out of his royal bed and, after eating his scrumptious royal breakfast, issued a royal proclamation that anyone in his kingdom who wanted to make or repair shoes must first purchase a very expensive permit. The king knew that the old man he'd visited the night before could never afford a permit, so he thought happily, well, this will put him out of business, and that's just what I intended. Curious, though, how the cobbler had fared without his work. That night, the king, in disguise again, returned to the old ramshackle cottage. when he knocked on the door, the old fellow opened it and greeted him as though he were a dear friend. "Blessed be God, day by day," were the first words out of his mouth. The king's face began to redden. He had not expected this. When the man offered the king food and drink, the king replied, "How have you food and drink? I heard a decree had been issued requiring an expensive permit for those doing cobbling." "Yes, that is so," said the cobbler, "but blessed be God day by day. I earned money today drawing water from the wells and delivering it to my neighbors." The king could have strangled the man on the spot, but instead, without a word, turned and left the cottage. And as you might imagine, next morning the king issued another royal proclamation, this one declaring that no one could draw water from any well in the kingdom. Of course, the foolish king hadn't realized the consequences of this new proclamation. It meant that no one could draw water for him at the castle, since in his anger at the cobbler, it hadn't occurred to him to make an exception for himself in the proclamation. But none of that mattered to the king, at least not yet. He had enough water at the castle to see him through the day. And that night, he went back to the old man's cottage, hoping to see that he had finally broken the poor cobbler's spirit. But you know by now what happened when he knocked on the cottage door. The cobbler opened it, smiled a wide grin, and said, "Blessed be God, day by day, if it isn't my old friend." "Come in," he said. "Will you have something to eat and drink?" The king came in, but only long enough to learn how the cobbler had earned his money today. "I chopped down trees," the cobbler told him. "Then I sold the wood and had enough to buy bread, and I had drinking water left from yesterday. Blessed be God, day by day." Without saying a word, the king turned and left the cottage. And while you might think he returned to the palace and next day issued a proclamation outlawing the cutting down of trees, he did not. For it was the king's spirit which had more or less been broken. He had decided he wanted nothing more to do with that cobbler in the tumble-down cottage. The king would just pretend he didn't exist. The king did, however, say to his royal advisors that he had now met the most foolish man in the entire kingdom. He told them, "This man has nearly nothing to his name, and yet over and over and over again he says, 'Blessed be God day by day.' Most foolish man in the kingdom." It is just possible, of course, that the king had met not the most foolish man in his kingdom, but the wisest. For the old cobbler believed the truth of what a man named James had written in a little book in the Holy Scriptures, the Holy Scriptures being the only book he owned. James had written, "Every good gift comes down from the Father." And so the cobbler just naturally gave thanks to his Father in heaven for the good gifts he received, however small they might have seemed to the king. For him, having food and drink each day and the strength to do his work was quite enough reason to say, "Blessed be God, day by day." Amen.